For many centuries, the Levant has enjoyed a rich artistic history and tradition, with a common and unique identity. Artists from the Levantine region embarked on many expeditions to further broaden their influences and knowledge. Many went to the West to continue their education and were exposed to different genres of art. For so many modern and contemporary artists, we can see these influences seamlessly combined with inspiration and techniques from the East. Art from the Levant has been used as a means of expression, a powerful platform to promote its people's vision, their aspirations, and their dreams. In a world that is increasingly divided, art can be unique in its ability to unite, a means of bringing together different cultures, nationalities, and religions, as well as being an important tool for cultural diplomacy and raising awareness and understanding of the Levant region. Over the last 10 years, we've seen increasing international awareness and appreciation for Middle Eastern art, with many of the strongest and most sought-after artists stemming from the Levant region. Today we'll dig a little deeper and explore the evolution of Levantine art, its shared characteristics, the role its contemporary artists are playing, as well as the increasing impact it's having on the art world globally. I now have the great pleasure and honor of introducing our panelists today. First, I'd like to introduce Rade Amer, a leading contemporary artist in the middle. Rade was born in Cairo, but relocated with her family to France at the age of 11, where she began her artistic studies. Since 1995, she's been living and working in New York. Rade's work has been exhibited at many leading institutions, including the Venice Biennale, the Sydney Biennale, the Whitney Biennale, and at the Brooklyn Museum. Rade continues to challenge and innovate with her thought-provoking paintings, drawings, and sculpture. Perhaps best known for her embroidery paintings, her work is intentionally feminine and seeks to empower women. Rade once said, "The history of art was written by men, in practice and in theory. Painting in the 20th century became the expression of masculinity, especially through abstraction. I create materially abstract paintings, but I integrate in this male field a feminine universe, that of sewing and embroidery." Next, I'd like to introduce Saleh Barakat, widely regarded as one of the leading authorities on modern and contemporary Arab art. Saleh was one of the first players to enter this field, having founded Ajyal Art Gallery in 1991, and thereafter Saleh Barakat Gallery in 2016. Saleh has helped assemble some of the most important collections of Arab art, and has placed Arab artists in many leading international institutions, such as the Tate Modern, Centre Pompidou, and Guggenheim in New York. Saleh has curated many pan-Arab exhibitions, and his recent focus has been to develop Beirut as a cultural incubator in the Levant region. And finally, we have Sarah Raza. Sarah is the Guggenheim UBS map curator for the Solomon Guggenheim Museum in New York, having previously been curator of the Mariah Art Center in Sharjah, as well as head of education and public programs at Yarat Contemporary Art Space in Baku, and curator of public programs at the Tate Modern in London. Sarah is also the long-standing West and Central Asia editor of Art Asia Pacific magazine and author of Punk Orientalism, which will be published later this year. Let's get started. Saleh, I'm going to start with you. What does the Levant region share in terms of common cultural, linguistic, and artistic heritage?
Hello, everybody. Well, actually, the Levant really has a fantastic shared history. So the whole region went through, and I'm going to be a little bit, mention it, but I have to, the Mesopotamian rule. So the whole region went through the Sumerian, the Akkadian, the Babylonian, the Assyrian, the Persian, the Pharaohic, the Greek, the Roman, the Palmyran, the Byzantine, the Umayyad, the Abbasid, the Mongolian, the Crusader, the Mamluk, the Ottoman, and finally the French and the British Mandate. the whole region went through all these civilizations, through all these culture, and we share all of them all together. Is the Levantine identity culture that we are trying to defend today. Uh, the whole region also has shared religions, from the adoration of Baal to Gilgamesh, Zeus, Jupiter, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. It's probably one of the last regions in the world where you can find most of the old Christian minorities and the many offshoots of Islam and Zoroastrians, Manichaeans, Baha'is, Yazidis, Kaka'is. I mean, there are so many different factions that are still living and existing in this part of the world. Throughout the Levant, we share multiple ethnicities. We have Arabs, we have Kurds, we have Armenians, Circassians, Assyrians, Sephardi Jews. We speak so many languages: the Arabic, the Aramaic, the Syriac, the Kurdish, the Armenian, the Karshuni, the Hebrew, the Yazidi. And just to give an example about this mix, Gog and Magog, or what we call in Arabic Yajuj or Majuj, are a good example of the mythical figures that are cross-civilizational in this region. The first mention of Gog and Magog from the land of Gog from the land of Magog was in all the Syriac texts. Then they found their way into the Bible in Ezekiel, then into the early Christian literature in Apocalypse, then into the Quran. So Levantine culture is a very accumulated strata of different cultures and civilization that have learned to coexist, live together, not annihilate one another, and just take from each other. They include, they do not exclude.
And how did Oriental Christian iconography and Islamic Sufism influence secular Levantine artists?
Well, to arrive to this century, I mean, in the Levant, in this culture that I belong to and I try to defend, you know, you have Muslim artists who are very much influenced by Christian iconography. We may see some images, I hope, and like crucifixion, like maternity. And then at the same time, you can find many Christian artists that are, well, this is an example of an artist working using crucifixion in his contemporary art. It's not religious art at all, but it's a very secular art. The next one will be about the maternity, but then the other images will come about Christian artists who are inspired by Islamic Sufism and geometry. And how can we translate all these into universal forms? How can we use ornamentation that is very specific to this area and make it an art that is readable by Japanese and Argentinian and all the different people in this era of globalization? What I defend in the art of the contemporary Levant is this capacity to be able to talk to different cultures from all global culture, but keeping in it also all these specificities of the Levant about coexistence and living together and tolerating each other.
Let's focus now a little on women artists and modernity. Rada, you're an artist who seeks to innovate. What are the different mediums and practices you employ, and how has modernity influenced your art?
Well, I'm best known for my embroidery painting, as you have mentioned, and but I do use other mediums. I do gardens, and I work in collaboration with an Iranian artist called Reza Farkhonde. And I do bronzes and video, and yeah, and some photography, but not much. And lately, I've been developing ceramics. I just want to say a few notes why I started to do the work I do in embroidery. I grew up in France, in Nice, and I had in the 80s, late 80s, and during that time, something very weird has happened in Egypt. Is like more and more veiled women were wearing the veil without being like without the. It's not like the Iranian Revolution was they have been forced to wear the veil, but they have been wearing the veil by themselves. And then I was studying at that time in France, and I wanted to study painting. And I had to deal with all of this problem of Egypt, woman, my body, because this time I was growing up. And then in France, I went to the painting department and I wanted to take painting. And the professor refused to teach painting to women. And this was very shocking and very upsetting to me because suddenly I realized that, well, there is no difference for the fate of women in the West or in the East. And I went to the library and I looked into art history books to find out where are the women artists. And I couldn't find any. And this is why I started. So I decided that I will not use painting, or I would use painting the least possible, or mix it with, I had to invent a new medium to speak about this in my work.
And Saleh, carrying that on, what impact do you feel women artists from the Levant have had?
Yeah, I would like to mention that usually when people look at the Arab world, they always think that women are veiled and they are not playing a big role in the society. But this is really not true, because particularly in the Levant, women have a lot of presence, particularly in the arts. And I mean, they have a presence since the turn of the last century. We have fantastic women, pioneer artists who started their career in the 1920s. I mean, just after the renaissance of that period. And they really spearheaded a kind of presence in the art scene, and they are till today very much present. They represent practically 50% of the artists in this area, and they know how to defend themselves very strongly. Yesterday with Ghada, we were having it's a nice anecdote, but she was saying in the beginning of her career, her dream was to be a white...
No, not in the beginning, now.
Okay. She wanted to be a white British male because it's so much easier to make it here in America. And I answered her, I want to be Ghada Amir. So you made it, you made it.
And Sarah, which female artists stand out for you?
Well, there are a number of female artists. We have to point to the fact that women have been great patrons in the Middle East and the Levant region. For example, Faranisa Ziad, who was an Ottoman princess, she established the Khaled Shuman Foundation, and Amman, and a little bit further, Empress Faradiba from Iran, where my family is from, was a great patron of the arts. So we had women that were inspiring, but also inspiring a generation of not just cultural practitioners, but also artists. But in terms from a contemporary perspective, it's an interesting question. I've been following the work of Mona Hatoum for a number of years, very important artist from the Levant region, but also one that has looked at ideas around displacement, migration, exile, extending the conversation beyond the region, looking at its relationship to Europe, looking at its relationship to the concept of empire, because we can't look at one without the other. So obviously, geography, gender, they're almost simultaneous in the conversation around contemporary art and artists. I don't think necessarily they're exclusive. But it is important to kind of point out that the role of women, there is a much more higher visibility, but in the region, but also internationally, with a number of retrospectives that have been dedicated to women artists from this particular region. Etel Adnan showed at the Serpentine Gallery an artist in her later years, in addition to her Salwa Wada Shakher, had a retrospective at the Tate Modern, and this is all evident of the role of women artists. And this is, as I also mentioned, not just exclusive to Levantine region, but also a wider trend of women artists across the globe getting recognition.
Absolutely. Saleh, what does the Levant region bring to the rest of the art world?
Well, today, the contemporary generation of artists is really bringing something I find pretty interesting for the international art scene. And by this, I mean those artists working on the current politics. Politics is extremely important. The region is so not stable that people indirectly have to be implicated in all the changes happening. And so we are implicated, whether we like it or not, whether we choose or not, by the current politics. And we can see a generation of artists like Walid Rad, Ali Shari, Hirer Sarkisian, Mahmoud Ubaidi, working on fiction, on archaeology, on historiography. I mean, these trends have become acknowledged today in the contemporary art world, thanks partly to many of the artists coming from the Levant. Also the representation of violence. Unfortunately, there is so much violence that somehow it has become the language that many of our artists are tackling in order to fight violence. In fact, not because we have become violent, but to denounce violence that is growing in this part of the world. And I think the artists of the Levant, by being so much drowned into this current politics and violence, they bring in to the art scene something that is very peculiar.
And Sarah, do you see politics from the region represented in the art?
Well, of course, you can't really divorce art and politics, but first and foremost, I don't believe that artists are politicians. You know, they provide us with a new prism to look at art ideas about our society, but they shouldn't be given that status. Neither, I don't think they would like it. I think that what they allow us is to see the world through alternative lens, through visual culture, which is why the Levant is such a unique set of constellations. I like to think of it as a set of constellations, all these different centers with the artists are in engagement. There is some sort of cultural affinity there, not just with the region, but also with Europe as well, because of the constructed nature, because of the advent of colonial histories. There is that dialogue, and it kind of goes between the West and the East. It's a kind of process of negotiation, rather.
And as a curator, what legacy does UBS bring to the region?
That's a really interesting question, because this project, like with other initiatives, does have complications. It is a little bit of a paradox, but it was intended, the Global Art Initiative at the Guggenheim was intended to diversify the US collection, to bring in artists for the third and final phase from the Middle East and North Africa, which is what I was charged with. But for me, it was very important. The gender balance was important. 50% of women, 50% of men were brought into the collection, but also correcting of some wrongs. I mean, I was able to start with a blank slate, look at the collection, look at the artists that are already in there, but also bring in artists, major artists from the region, such as Emily Jassier. She was one of the only Hugo Boss Prize winners, which is a very prestigious prize at the Guggenheim, who'd never been acquired by the institution. So I was able to bring a very sizable work of hers into the collection, which is going to be there as a permanent legacy. I brought in 28 artworks by over 20 artists into the Guggenheim for the American collection, not for the Abu Dhabi collection. This is very separate. They will still be there after I've expired, so there is a strong legacy there, an artistic language that will go on for generations and generations. I mean, I can't avoid the kind of relationship, the kind of neo-colonial relationship between this part of the world and America. We want to obviously not alienate, but create a dialogue. And artists allow us to converse in languages that are, you know, far more sophisticated. And sometimes they don't require a kind of more formal language. Maybe it's slightly informal. And maybe they rely a little bit on poetic languages as well.
Absolutely.
I would like just to add something I forgot, but it's about a specificity in the, not specificity, but something that is very present in Levantine art today, which is the capacity to play with censorship. We are countries where there is a lot of taboos and a lot of political pressures, and art is really one of the most powerful tools to express the desire for change. It's incredible to see how artists are capable of using art in order to bring change into these societies. So that is also something that is very interesting to watch in Levantine art scene.
Rada, let's bring the focus back to you a little bit. You left Egypt at a very young age and traveled to France and thereafter the US. Have you noticed any of your Egyptian heritage and identity influence your art, particularly following subsequent visits back home?
Well, as I said yesterday, I never wanted to be an Egyptian artist, and I've been battling with this since I was at school, because I think just putting like a region where you come from, or a race or a religion on somebody is very limiting, and it makes you like the other. And that's why I want to become a white male British artist, because this is exactly why. So, and in school as well, when I was at school, I was assigned in the first year. They told me, I was making like some drawings, and then I always liked to paint the nudes, so I was like, I don't know what I was doing. And then the professors come and told me, I don't know, you are from the Middle East, you should work on calligraphy. So he gave me a work that I have to do on calligraphy. So I decided that I am going to give him a blank page, and I gave him a blank page, and he said, what did you do? I said, no, I refuse what you are saying. And then he gave me an F. But I thought it was a very well artistic F. I thought it So I have always had this problem. But of course, you know, like always your you know, where you come from or where you go, because in the same time, I don't think they would have done for the work I do if I didn't live in France either. So like you wherever you go, you bring in like the culture just give you something, and then you just add on it. So now maybe like this is where I wanted to show the images of my work, but it's I don't know if we can have it. Like now I do make calligraphy. It's very funny, but it was so I did, like, it came back, yeah, because it came back because like, especially when it was yeah, this one is good, because in 2010 I always made writing after school, but I never used Arabic writing. I refused to do this. But then my sister, who is a scholar, with whom she gives me a lot of ideas, and she told me, do you know that in the Arab world we have 100 words to say love? And I told her, but why don't we use it? You know, like, because now we are like we are terrorists. It's bad. So I decided to work with this 100 words of love. So it's coming back in a way. I don't know.
So really, we can describe you as a universal artist. Is that fair?
What?
We can describe you as a universal artist.
Maybe. I don't know.
And your art is certainly provocative. What reaction do you seek from your audience?
No, I am not. I don't seek any provocation. My art that I do it really for myself. I do it when I started, especially like the erotic painting that I have started, it was a kind of revolt as well against my parents, because I am with a very conservative family, and the sexuality is taboo and all of this, and I was at school, and then I always liked to paint the nude, and my parents were very upset that I went to school already to study art. Like, they wanted me to study medicine. Anyway, so for me and at the time I was between Egypt, the people are wearing the veil, I don't know why, and my mom wore the veil, everybody's wearing this, and then I go to France, and this guy doesn't want to teach women, so I was really in a very, no. So it was my way of expressing for myself. I think I would have gone crazy otherwise, like if I didn't do what I saw. Most of all, this art is for myself. I said, yes, I want to talk about this. I want to talk about sexuality. I'm not scared, and I'm going to talk about it. And then this is how it develops. So, but
You have a provocative mind.
no, it's
Sarah, what role do contemporary artists play in shaping civil society in the Levant?
That's another large question. Back to my point that first and foremost, artists aren't politicians, but they do provide us with an avenue about rethinking some of the more challenging issues that we're facing at the moment. Could we kindly have the images, please? I will cite a few images when I speak about this point, in particular to my recent exhibition, But a Storm is Blowing from Paradise at the Guggenheim Museum in New York. And I've been looking at new ways in which to present the region, particularly as a responsibility as a curator, as an art historian, to deflect, kind of move away from politicized readings of the region, but kind of look at more poetic analysis, looking at environmental catastrophe, not necessarily focusing on some of the dire situation, and ways in which that could entice a much larger conversation. If we're thinking about shaping civil society, I don't want to look at it from a nostalgic perspective. Obviously, I'm fully aware that we are the cradle of civilization. Many of the ideas that have enmeshed in Western or European continental philosophy, science, all emerge from this part of the world. But I'm not approaching it as a situation that once upon a time, this is how it was. I'm looking at something that has occurred, but how can we move on? How can artistic voices provide us with new avenues at rethinking some of the more complex systems around the region? And in particular, this work is by an Iranian artist, Abbas Akavan, who has been looking at botany and the study of plants. And these are plants that were once native to the Tigris-Euphrates river system, which is now contemporary day Iraq, that were polluted by Saddam Hussein. He then took these plants, he found them in England in a horticultural garden, and he cast them in bronze and exaggerated their scale. When they're placed on white sheets, it could be reminiscent of a funeral site, like the way in which bodies are wrapped in a shroud in Islam and Judaism. The plants have been exaggerated to reflect human scale. It's called Study for a Monument. It's interesting because monuments in the Levant region have been particularly of former dictators, were always in bronze and upright, and here you see the scale has been reversed. But they also solicit other ideas about genocide, but also the illicit sale of antiquities, which has fueled such horrific enterprises such as ISIS. You know, the horrific sale of antiquities, human trafficking, oil. It's all reminiscent there. I'm interested in languages around smuggling, and I don't mean that in an illicit sense. I mean how artists use contraband and slip certain metaphors in. Moving on to the next image. Another example of using environmental kind of catastrophe is looking at mapping or cartography in a different way. This is part of a series called Trembling Passage by Ali Sherry, who is a Lebanese artist who lives and works between France and Beirut. And he chose a series of cities from the Levant and the Maghreb, North African region as well, that have undergone political turmoil in the 20th century. However, they are also prone to earthquakes. So he's taking the maps and he's cited the coordinates of where the fault lines exist. Again, another kind of shift away from politicized reading to look at environmental catastrophe, or rather act of God. An earthquake is considered an act of God. It's not even, something that can be motivated. But it's interesting that these maps take on a military language, because often in terms of when a city is going to be carpet bombed, these are the kind of drone images that appear. And if we look at the last image, another example I want to give is looking at, Salah had mentioned a group of very accomplished Lebanese artists that reflected on the Civil War years, and particularly artists who either left and went to Europe or North America for their education, and then came back after the Civil War, 1990, to reflect upon the changes that had occurred during this period, and how they developed new languages, and particularly using myth, using fiction. These are a series of 355 books by Lebanese duo Joanna Haji Thomas and Khalil Jarraj. They're a husband and wife couple that reflect upon a fictitious character called Abdallah Faraj. He was a former, a fake character that appears in their work over the last decade, and he's a photographer, an aging man who has covered the entire civil war. And he is unable to go out, but he takes one photograph a day. He sometimes can't process the photograph, so he writes a notation in his notebooks. And this is an entirely fictional project. And it looks at the kind of history of archiving information as well, because sometimes there is just nothing. There's a blank page where he doesn't quite remember what actually occurred. So it looks at memory, history, and the kind of opaque nature of how some histories have been intentionally kind of hidden or misconstrued from the public. And in addition to the series of books, you see a monitor, and on there is a performance of one actor cutting a book and the other one reading the image. So he reads the notation out. So quite a beautiful gesture, but it does look at heritage and archaeology and kind of preservation of history from a very interesting point, from both fiction, accessing it, the real through a fictitious angle, also myth-making as well. And I think these are all strategies employed by contemporary artists to kind of question what constitutes a civil society. And then particularly when we're looking at such initiatives as today, where we're looking at rebuilding, artists have a huge prominent position within that jigsaw, if you like, to bring it together and to allow us to access through visual culture what is possibly lost.
Saleh, what do you think? Are artists from the region aspirational? Are they seeking change?
Of course, I mean, definitely. And that's why I say they are, sorry. Yes, definitely. And that's why I use the word political at the beginning, because unfortunately we are such an unstable region, and we don't have the luxury of being able as artists, I mean, to talk about the theory of color or how we should use our brush stroke, or, I mean, there are so many things happening in this area. And in fact, maybe I would like to add that the Levant is this probably one of the earliest agricultural societies. This is where the 10 oldest cities still inhabited in the world are there. And therefore, when you are coming from this agricultural place where you need to grow a tree and your kids will eat from it, I mean, you will have to learn about tolerance, about living with your neighbors. And this is, I would like, I mean, we've talked all this day about this and food and music and everything, but this is the beauty of the Levant. We consider, I mean, thank you, Jamal, Daniel, but we are custodians of 1,000 years of traditions, and we need to keep them. There is a kind of a tsunami going through this region, and the artists and the people of culture in this part of the world are somehow, they consider themselves trying to preserve. I mean, they have this duty, this obligation to preserve, and hence the artist becomes a missionary. He cannot just watch from afar. He's implicated. He is living it from within, and therefore we are required by definition to bring answers. And probably this conference is one of those initiatives where we are shedding light on not only on armies and killing and violence and what have you, but on the people, that how much positiveness exists, and artists really are today probably the best ambassador, or they are given the pedestals in order to defend this kinds of positiveness coming from this very important region.
And Sarah, how important is proximity to geography?
Well, in recent years, what we've witnessed with the war and the conflict in the region, a lot of artists are displaced. But I don't necessarily see displacement or migration as a negative thing. I mean, if we think about the way the region was initially prior to the 19th century with the various constellations that the Ottomans had helped establish, there was a lot of free trade and movement of people. People could study in Jaffa, they could go to Damascus, and with the, which is known as a Hijazi railroad that the Ottomans helped build, was a really great movement, not just for a commerce, but also for culture, for education. And there was some proximity to that. I mean, people learned from one another. Artistic centers moved around. But with the recent events, I mean, there have been other people in the region and the diaspora who have stepped forward to support. For example, the work of Sheikh Hassan in Qatar. He supported a number of Iraqi artists during the war to bring them to safety in Doha, in Qatar. Or, for example, the great work that was happening in Sharjah under Sheikh Ahur, where she's established the Sharjah Binali, which became a kind of hub for artists from the Levant to be able to have still a regional voice, but also have some degree of proximity. But when I think about artists, also to just expand, who are based in Europe, artists from the Levant region who have gone to France to live, you know, it's not by accident that they are there. The Levant or the Middle East is a construct at the end of the day. So there were British and European interests there. So they were able to kind of move through that as well. So there is definitely value in that. There is value for artists who live and work in different cities between the Levant and internationally, but also those that speak several languages, who are able to think in two minds, I think is definitely positive. And the fact that we're sitting here in Washington today is a great testament to the kind of power of proximity. And sometimes that does allow us to kind of really reflect upon something. When you're too close to something, it can often, you know, obviously there are benefits in that, in being on site, but there are definitely benefits to expanding the conversation and having it as a kind of wider dialogue.
But Saleh, do you feel artists who stay in the Levant are somehow at a disadvantage by not being abroad, learning new techniques, experiences?
Disadvantage and also advantage. I mean, it depends on the angle you look at it. Disadvantage for sure, when you stay back there, you are not given the kind of accreditation or how do we say, to be known in the West, or to have the access to museums. But at the same time, being there is a kind of resilience and sort of the resistance. I mean, when you stay there, your discourse will be different. It will be directed to your own society, the people living there, because there are also millions of people who have not been given the opportunity to leave. So for me, I've always looked at this question of the people staying in the diaspora as being a positive on one side, because these artists of the diaspora will come back with new technologies, with new discourses, with new openings. At the same time, you have those who stay, who are custodians also of the heritage that they have inherited back, and they need to preserve. So it's this interaction between all of these people that eventually make things go forward.
And what more can we all do to internationalize artists from the Levant further?
That's an interesting question. Of course, I guess there should be more due diligence from Western curators toward the Middle East by going there, because sometimes it's easier to go to the people that are closer to you, and then we end up shedding light more on the artists of the diaspora, which are great artists, of course, but I think also the artists of the diaspora should be more in communication with the people back home. And but unfortunately, because of the situation of the Levant, many people are afraid to go there. So it ends up we are being marginalized more and more and alienated. And we need to create those kinds of institutions where people can have this accessibility to go and exchange, because I think the real place is really creating more visibility, more exchange.
And Sarah, as a curator?
Well, I
what do you
think
say?
visibility is key, representation is key. These artists need the opportunity to be in collections so they can be shared, their works can travel, their ideas can migrate through that. I mean, from my own experience, I know that bringing in a number of artists from the Levant has been changing for their careers. You know, now that they are on the platform of the Guggenheim, there are institutions all over the world, you know, asking, requesting to borrow their work. But the conversation can't just exist in one kind of realm. It has to, Salah, you're absolutely right that there has to be a dialogue between artists from the region and those forth. But it has to shift in terms of arts education, I think. That's where it really needs to start. That there has to be an exchange of residencies for more opportunities for artists to create these kind of dialogues, cross-cultural or trans-cultural dialogues rather, but also to give, to shift some of the Western kind of examples of academia to not think of these as other modernisms or contemporary art elsewhere, but to integrate it as a larger kind of piece. And with the advent of technology, there is a lot that we can do. We can be sitting here and having a conversation with somebody in Beirut or in Damascus or in Baghdad. So I definitely think we should be able to utilize all our tools in order to, you know, find a commonality there.
Well, thank you so much for all your comments. It's been very informative. Thank you.
Thank you.